Hello and welcome to Reawakening the Sacred Self, finding the way back to our ancestral soul, where we have gathered together Indigenous elders, wisdom keepers, spiritual teachers, healers, visionaries, and inspirational speakers to share their wisdom and insights as to how we can live a spiritual life that will also enhance and strengthen our relationship with Mother Earth, who is the guardian of our ancestral soul. My name is Frances Billinghurst. I am your host and creatrix of this event, and I'm coming to you from Ghana country, where the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains are the traditional custodians. So, mani ngā padni. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me. I am delighted to welcome Daniela Simina. Welcome, Daniela. I do hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes, you did pronounce my name correctly. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is an honor and a joy to be here to such a prestigious event with such a graceful host talking about what I'm most passionate about, fairies and connecting with land and with ancestors, both spiritual ancestors and ancestors that comes within one's family line. Thank you so much.
That's right. Thank you again for being part of this event. For everybody who is not familiar with her work, Dania is a native of Romania, a granddaughter of a fairy seer and medicine woman. She tapped into energy healing and herbal magic at a very young age and became acquainted with fairies through the local lore and folklore and through direct personal experience. Growing up, Daniela explored European native traditions of spiritual healing, deepened her understanding of both energy and human psychology through practicing martial arts and yoga, and never stopped researching fairy lore from different cultures. She teaches courses, classes, and workshops on various modalities of energetic rebalancing and, of course, fairies. Daniela is an author of a number of books, including Where Fairies Meet, Parallels Between Irish and Romanian Fairy Traditions, which will be released very shortly in June of this year. And also she has another book being released later in the year, A Fairy Path, Memoirs of a Young Fairy Seer. Her quest is to empower people to get in charge of their well-being through awakening to the enchantment of the natural energies and connecting with the magic of fairy. The title of Daniela's presentation, as she had mentioned, is Remembering Our Soul's Enchantment Through Fairy and Ancestral Wisdom. I am so honored to have you here, Daniela. I can barely get your introduction out due to my excitement, because this is a subject that I have a huge interest in myself, even though I'm not nearly as gifted as you.
Oh.
And I thought, because of your personal journey, having a grandmother as a fairy seer, medicine woman, that sounds so fascinating. Also, there's so many interpretations of fairies today. So maybe you can begin by first explaining what a fairy seer is, and to you, what are fairies?
The answer to the question is really multi-layered, because I will start with explaining fairy seer. In Romania, we do not have the exact linguistic equivalent for what would be a fairy doctor or a fairy witch. The name witch, if used like really casual in conversation, can rub people the wrong way because it has acquired really negative connotations. I'm part of the movement that wants to reclaim fairy witch and leave those negative connotations kind of aside. So the term fairy seer would refer to somebody who can interact with fairies in a very tangible way. So within the culture in Central, Eastern, Southern Europe, there are practitioners of folk medicine who receive guidance and primarily derive their knowledge from interacting with fairies. And fairies can appear and do appear to these people in dreams, in visions, but they also appear like embodied beings with different degree of corporality to them. This is how I did experience fairies as a child. Aside from what I heard, unavoidable, as you mentioned in my presentation, I grew up immersed in very rich fairy lore and folklore. And I used to see things and interact with things that right away, it didn't occur to me that those were fairies. And I was really young. I'm talking a child, 3, 4, 5 years old when these things began to happen. So fortunately, there was my grandmother there to begin to explain what was I dealing with. And she was, in a sense, keeping her practice shielded by a fair amount of secrecy. And this was happening for 2 reasons. One of them, in this agreement, in this partnership that fairy workers, fairy seers have with fairies themselves, there is a requirement from the fairies that a number of things are being kept secret and not like discussed too openly or, with too much ease. And the other aspect, Romania that I grew up in, it was during the communist regime. It was like the peak, the height of the communist regime. So a lot of folk practices had to be kept underground because the policy was one of indoctrination into a very materialistic, pragmatic mentality. So it was the denial of the spiritual, the denial and the denying of the spiritual dimension, and talking out there that, well, something my grandmother taught, she talks to fairies and she actually does fairy healing, that could have landed the whole family into trouble. And this is something that I discuss really in detail in the second book, will be released in December, The Memoirs of a Young Fairy Seer in Training. I'm the young fairy seer in training in the book. So that is how everything happened. So this is like a broad stroke overview of what a fairy seer would be in that cultural context. Similar people accomplishing similar jobs, working in partnership with fairies, are known as fairy doctors. Those who, interesting, they do get their powers from fairies, but are also told how to heal fairy-caused ailments and all kinds of problems. And there are the fairy witches who have their well noted for their fairy familiars, fairy partners, fairy guides, who are there, side by side and teaching them how to use herbs or how to do different types of healing. As far as what fairies are, probably you'll get as many answers as many people you would ask. My take on it, I use fairy in a very general, especially for the purpose of the discussion we're having today. I'm going to keep it like very general, broad umbrella term, where fairy beings from different cultures will gather underneath. I may refer to fairies as known from Norse and Germanic cultures, the elves, the Alfar, and I will mention fairies, so I'm not going to enumerate like a whole list. In Romania, the equivalent of fairy beings that we encounter in the Irish tradition, in Irish, we have the she. In Romania, we have the zune, which again, are several types there. So fairies will describe beings that are decidedly otherworldly. They have magical powers. They have the ability to appear in various forms, and with different degree of substance, of corporeal presence to them. They could appear fully embodied, like interacting with a person and that you would assume is a person, and then something gives them away that they're not quite humans. They're a person, but it's not a human person. Or they could be that fleeting vision that you get in the corner of the eyes. They're not every single lens flare that appears on your camera. They're not every single, bird or animal that looks a little bit different than the ordinary. So there is a difference in between claiming that, oh, I really saw a fairy, or I had a fairy visitation or interaction with a fairy, and a trivial natural occurrence. And this is where discernment is good to come into place.
Yes, certainly. I recall, I would say it was an encounter with a fairy a number of years ago. I have to confess I'm very logical when it comes to these sort of in between realms, but of all places, because back in the 90s, I was actually in Ireland and queuing up to go to Blarney Castle, of all places. And I'd actually walked around the garden, and there was something that caught my eye amongst the trees, and there was sort of a bit of a half light there, and it was this thing moving. And all I could do was just see the vibrations of its wings.
Ooh.
And I had a feeling, if it dropped into my heart center as opposed to my analytical head, that it was a fairy, because it was bigger than an insect. It wasn't like a dragonfly, but very similar. Its body was longer, like almost humanistic, but it wasn't as big as even like a sparrow or a tiny little bird. So I've always held the belief that I actually saw a fairy or a fey creature of some description. And with it being Blarney Castle in Ireland, I have no reason to doubt it. Other people might think that I'm crazy, but that very first encounter sort of stepped me away from, oh, they're just make-believe characters in books and the fairy tales that we often read about, to what we find, as you mentioned, through a lot of folklore, especially around Europe, but also all around the world. And again, coming back to England, Britain, Scotland, I was also spent some time up on the Isle of Skye, where there's the Dunvegan Castle. And I don't know if you've heard about that, because there's a sort of a traditional law with I think it's the Clan MacLeod, who actually owned the Dunvegan Castle, about a fairy flag. And this myth or story, dating back to, I think, the 15th, 16th century, has this fairy lore woven through their own sort of like ancestral line, which I find really fascinating. And reminds me when you're talking about how you sort of were introduced to it with your grandmother, the similarities of it, that what we see in the sort of mass media isn't necessarily for those who work with the fairies, with the fae, with other beings of that sort of liminal space, how they actually project their own selves. Would you agree with my summary of that your own personal encounters are maybe a little bit different to what we read about in books and the other folklore that we come down to?
Oh, absolutely. So far we're in agreement with everything that you said. Um, Furry experiences, I think it goes both ways. They're shaped, our encounters with fairies are shaped to a certain degree of our not really expectations, but the culture that we grew up with and what we know, what we think they might be. Short small parenthesis here, it's like when you go for a specific foraging for mushrooms. For a while you don't know exactly what you're looking about, but then you spot a specific one, and then you know exactly, and more and more and more of those begin popping around you. So in Romanian lore, fairies, and that was the striking parallel with the Irish She. Fairies are usually like 5 to 6 feet tall, so they're very tall, they're very imposing. I personally never saw a fairy with wings, which does not mean that fairies with wings that do not exist. I believe they come in so many shapes and sizes and are so varied in their characteristics. If we consider how many cultures and cultures within cultures we have around the world. And each of them know of some sort, some type of fairies, then it would be very presumptuous for any of us to say, I know exactly what fairies are and how they look like, because I believe we can only acquire partial knowledge depending on where we're more drawn, to look for. So you're not the first one, however, who describes a fairy with this kind of looking a little bit like a dragonfly, but not really like a dragonfly, little human-like shaped body and with wings. You're not the first one who gives this description, and it was like 100% real. The person had the experience. So it's nothing, made up just for entertainment or taken from a different source. So it really does happen. We are.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned this sort of interest that you also have, sort of looking at the difference between your own cultural folklore and traditions of Romania, and also how the Irish, because as I said, my experience actually was in Ireland, because the Irish have a huge underpinning of fairy folklore in particular all through the country. During this time when I actually was in Blarney and I saw that, I then went around the Connemara, and I was on, I'm just trying to think, there was a number of years, we're talking about the 90s, so it was a long time ago, which is why my memory's a little bit hazy, but I remember that this elderly woman in the Connemara who would, because they were very religious, very Catholic, would go to church, but they would leave offerings out for
Yes.
play, whether it was milk or honey, or they had this, and it wasn't quite superstition, it was part of their cultural understanding, connection with the land, which I found really interesting. And then when I was studying Celtic myth, the whole concept of the Tuatha Dé Danann, how they were, the myths around them is that they sort of merged into the fairy mounds. So they were, when the later invasion, so to speak, the sons of Mill came through. So again, as you were saying, fairies are more than these sort of like images of humanistic creatures with wings that we often read about. I'm wondering too how much of your Romanian background and knowledge that your grandmother stowed upon you has sort of sparked and also enhanced your own relationship with Fae as well.
Wow, that's first of all, I want to piggyback on something that you just mentioned, and there's a story that I'm particularly fond of, that of the Tuatha Dé Danann going into the fairy mounds. And this kind of bridges more into our connection with ancestors. So Tuatha Dé Danann go into the mounds, basically underground, and then the sons of Mill, who took over Ireland, they fail to honor their part of the bargain and provide offerings to the fairies. And what happens next is the land of Ireland, which is so fertile and so rich and so abundant in everything, stops being rich and abundant, like overnight. So Amergin goes to negotiate on behalf of the sons of Mill, and he talks to Andagda, who holds both status of god and fairy king. He's known as the fairy or king of all fairies in Ireland. And Dagda says, now you're going to come back and hold your promise, and you're going to make these offerings of milk and grains. And so there's a list of offerings that they're bound to give to the fairies periodically if they want everything, to go well in their economy and in their, lives. So this carries into the habit, into the tradition of living, as you so well said, is not superstition, it's part of the living culture, this living outside offerings to the fairies. And this is what I saw my grandmother doing. And when I first saw her doing it, I didn't exactly know what it was. Again, it took her a while to completely open up. And I was like maybe 8 or 9 years old when she really opened up and began to tell me more about that she's actually working with fairies. Until then, it was like this general broad stroke fairy, not fairy, healer, folk practitioner of, medicine, and we don't have to really get into the public eye. But then the fairy dimension moved into the foreground. And it basically started with this ritual that I saw her doing. It happened on a Thursday before the Easter Sunday. And it was about, we have this beautiful gazebo in the house where we lived. I mean, in the backyard of the house where we lived. And she would set up the table and put like 3 little loaves of bread that she baked, and it was a candle, and me going there, and I wanted to eat it, and she's like, no, you don't touch that. That's an offering. And I'm like, offering for whom? So under pressure, being pestered by a 7 or 8 years old, she began, to tell me. And then she's like, okay, heck, this is what it is. These are offerings to the fairies, but, make sure you don't talk to other children, because that's not really something we want to talk about. And then she went on to tell me how she was participating in these rituals with her grandmother, and how these rituals in the time past were far more ample. They would build a fire from specific woods. I remember dogwood, I remember rowan, I remember as being part of what they burn. I don't remember really the other two. And then all the setting of offerings for the fairies, and they would like say an invitation, like a chant invitation for them, and then they would leave the offerings there overnight, and whatever it was left, you would take them away in the next morning. And then with my own research, then of course I wanted to know more. Who else is doing offerings? When visiting with people in the rural areas, relatives, friends of friends, I ended up knowing and actually participating in ritual offerings being made around Bialchina, around May Day. Ritual offerings being made especially around midsummer. And these offerings were made at in specific places like near waters or close to crossroads. And there was like the best tablecloth that you have, that's what you put it there. And it had to be a white chicken, of course cooked. You don't just cooked the white chicken and white breads and like the best of the best that you have. And they would set up a platter aside as an offering for the fairies. And there was the custom, whoever walks by, you invite them to come and join the picnic, because you wouldn't know whether that was a fairy or actually a person just passing. So since these were small communities, a stranger passing randomly around those times of celebration would have been unusual. So play it safe, ask them to join, because you might be offering to an actual fairy, and in being generous and nice toward the fairy being, that would guarantee good luck and protection. So of course, that when I began to tap and get more explanations around why things are being done in a certain way, I finally put 2 and 2 together, my own experiences, because I had, so one of my earliest fairy encounters, fairy experiences happened in my backyard. And that's in the second book in the memoirs. And this child appeared, and it wasn't a child whom I knew. It was a girl like myself. I thought, who knows, maybe someone who moved into the neighborhood. And I was asking things, and she was kind of answering tangent to my questions. I was asking her, I asked her, what's your name? And I couldn't really get an answer to that. And finally she goes, oh, let's play chase or something like this. And we begin running and we run toward the woods. And we're going really fast and really far, which I became really concerned. And hey, stop. It was me not telling her to stop. And she said, well, when I'm around you, you should not be afraid, which felt uncanny to say at least. And the moment after, she's gone. And I'm turning around 180 degrees and ran way faster back home, straight to my grandmother, telling her what was happening and a whole other dimension of my fairy experience. I mean, she realized at that point that the best way to keep me safe was to begin to actually exposing me of some of the, and this is where the herbalism, the spiritual herbalism came in, because that was the 101 fairy protection. This is how you use certain things. And this is how and this is what you use to ensure that the beings that come around you, one, cannot harm you if they intend to harm you. Second, you do attract those beings whom are known to be more benevolent and goodly inclined toward humans, because human propitiating fairies for good luck, that's kind of a tradition in Romania. So it was done especially in conjunction with midsummer, especially love magic. Oh, fairy heads. Always the best, were the best, to help. So yeah, that was my weaving my way into it.
Oh, that sounds fantastic, but also a bit of spine chilling, because especially at such a younger age too, being, oh, I wonder what would have happened if you'd gone into the forest with your fae companion. What
I
would
don't
have
know.
happened?
Probably we wouldn't be having this discussion now. I
No,
don't think
we hear the
there's a
stories of
chance.
the folklore of Rumpelstiltskin. Oh, no, not Rumpelstiltskin. Rip Van Winkle, who who entered into the fairy realm, and when he eventually emerged, it was like 10, 15 years later or something like that. Considerable time had passed. But no, you mentioned a few things. I just want to circle back to it about the offerings, and especially in the I don't like to use the word tales, because it, again, in our modern language, that sort of diminishes the importance of it, but also the lore that comes through from cultures that involve fairies, and in particular looking at, as you mentioned, the lore around the Tuatha De Danann and the sons of Mill, who, according to the Book of Invasions, where these stories come from, which is the anglicised version of the Gaelic, which I'm really bad at Gaelic. I won't even insult anybody by pronouncing that book, which talks about these invasions or realms of groups of people who came in to settle Ireland, and the sons of Mill, they say, are who we Homo sapiens are descendants of. But the Tuatha De Danann, there was this breach of contract between the otherworldly beings, the Tuatha De Danann, and the sons of Mill when it comes to the offerings. I mean, I'm thinking about how our world is today, climate change, global warming, whatever you want to term, or with the intensity of natural disasters. I'm living on, in Australia, driest continent, in the driest land, and a few years ago we had huge, intensive fires. It was so devastating. All around the world, there's been, even in America, intensive fires, in California in particular, blizzards and hurricanes, and it's just like, yes, these are part of the natural cycle of life, but they're getting more and more intense. So listening to this connection or the story of the Tuatha De Danann and the sons of Mill, it's almost like, have we forgotten connecting back to the otherworldly beings who the Fae are part of? Are we the sons of Mill who need to start creating our offerings in various manners which relate to our land, the giving back to our land. Is this something that you can see a connection with, knowing your background and your research into the fairy realms and our connection?
I can see more of a connection. There's multiple layers of connection, if I could state it this way. I believe that first of all, I believe that progress is good. So I'm not here, to advocate for a return to Middle Ages, because there's nothing to really be idealized about Middle Ages. They didn't have great plumbing. They didn't have great sanitary conditions. So that living in a castle and living in the woods, it may look good in movies. I'm not sure how feasible really is in actual living. But with the increase in industrialization, with the increase, the accelerated advance in technology, a rift in between us and nature has occurred. So we have become more estranged from nature. And while I do not believe that fairies are necessarily spirits of nature, I believe that some among the nature spirits happen to be fairies or have tangents, contingency to the realm of fairies. However, nature with capital N is still, for me, the common ground where fairy nature with lowercase n and human nature with lowercase n merge. Where am I coming up with this? Because it's not 100% original idea. It emerged from studying lore. As you mentioned in my introduction, I'm passionate about reading lore and learning from lore, both old and modern. So if you look at Norse and Germanic lore, the first settlers in Iceland, they first encounter land wights, and they first encounter elf beings, the Alfar, whom kindly begin to share with people what plants will grow, what plants and how, what they can do to cultivate the land, and where they should find the best places to shelter their animals, and what to feed those animals in really harsh conditions that Iceland provides, so they can survive as a community. And then, as there's countless accounts in the lore about the Alfar and humans getting together as couples and having children together. Now, whether somebody chooses not to believe that to be the case, that's fine. We still have the spiritual connection. The fact that they got there and somehow beings intrinsically connected to the land, these land wits and wights and elves, communicating and cater to the needs of the human community and help them survive. I mean, if that is not what a good ancestor does for you, I don't know what else it is. So they can be regarded in that way as ancestors. But also, if you want to consider the other, and it's kind of hard to ignore it, there's too much lore, too many accounts that talking about it across the world, human and fairy beings having kids together. So they also come into the human ancestry. And there is an author, there is Winifred Rose, who did a really, really thorough exploration of not only the concept, but also the models, the mystical models of souls. It goes also deep into psychology. And she talks about the solar, SOULAR model, where different parts aggregate to form the souls, the multi-layer soul that make up a human being or encounter in a human being. And she makes the point that elves, Alfar, wights, they have been in the land much longer, for far longer than humans have been around. And somehow this elf and waits and fairy DNA mingled with the human one. So however we turn and twist, we cannot disconnect ourselves from our this reality, or this view of reality of as us being connected to them. What impact this has in our breach of agreement? Well, when you're a very disobedient child, or a really child who does not really align to what your family values are, your father might as well disinherit you. Or you may be just left at your own devices. Maybe for some people, some spiritual fairy based traditions, they see fairies as guardians, and they're, you know, to raise flags and tell humans that they're going in the wrong directions. I'm not necessarily part of that movement, or I don't see it exactly that way, but I cannot ignore that what we are doing and our disconnecting and breaching our agreements with fairies and with what they represent has a price. We move farther and farther of ours from our spiritual roots, getting more and more into a materialistic mindset, and we become blinded to the fact that we keep destroying the environment. We sever our ancestral connections with the magic, with the wonder that fairy is, and we're basically just sowing the branch that we're sitting on. So I have in mind this image of a person sitting on a branch, and they're sewing in between themselves and the tree trunk, so not realizing that they will fall when that branch will be cut through. So I admire very much the work of two authors. One is Morgan Daimler, and the other one is Kat Heath, and they both advocate for reenchantment of the world. And recently, Kat Heath came up with a blog, and she said, we need reconstruction. We need something more radical. We need transformation beside just reenchantment. And it's basically what I try to do with my, through my work, bring awareness to the reality of fairy, to whatever you want to accept these beings, whether you choose to think as psychological through like Jungian psychology and see them as archetypes. If you choose to see them as aspects of your own subconscious, if you choose to see them as somehow related to the surrounding nature spirits, or if you're in the camp who sees them as it's been told about them for hundreds of years, thousands of years of lore, beings living in another dimension and interacting, being able to interact with the human world, we need them. We need their presence, and we need them more than they need us, because they have another world. If ours go to dogs, I'm not sure we can cross into theirs.
Oh, I can't agree with you more.
So that's one way to put it.
It's almost like, regardless of how we see fairies, and if I'm interpreting this correctly, regardless of what sort of mindset we're in, whether we just see them as characters from fairy tales, the books in our libraries, what we grew up with, or if we see them as real beings, and and regardless of what culture, what background, they have this connection, like all sort of beings that they fall into, of being connected so much with the land. And as you mentioned, which was really interesting, because of our own sort of ancestral connection with the land, they're also part of us, they're aspects of us as well. So it's almost like, and I have also started noticing more and more people like yourselves producing material almost like awakening us to this concept that it's not going to hurt us, or in fact, it's actually in our best interest to start looking beyond the sort of egocentric mindset of self and connecting back to what's really important, and that stems from our connection with Mother Earth, with the land, and with all the beings that reside in it. And one good way of doing that is probably reconnecting to the stories that we grew up with, whether we've dismissed them as an adult. And a lot of these stories had fairies or other elemental beings in them. And this is what I said, you've got a couple of books coming out this year. So firstly, congratulations. Having 2 books come out in 1 year is a huge achievement. Are you able to tell our audience something about these books? Because they do seem, by their titles, completely different books, even though they're both about fairies.
So the first book, Parallels Where Fairies Meet, Parallels Between Irish and Romanian Fairy Lore, is actually the first ever published study that brings side by side Irish and Romanian fairy lore. And I would like to mention from the start, this is not done with the intent of painting fairies across cultures with an exceedingly white brush and level them out and claim that, oh, fairies from everywhere are one and the same kind. It is about underlining the similarities that exist between 2 cultures, literally at the opposing ends of the European continent, with Ireland at the farther west, Romania far in the east, yet connected through so many similarities shared by the fairy beings that populate both cultures. And while they do have similarities as the broad common denominator, there are also very clearly representing the individual cultures that they evolve, that they populate. So it is a study, lots of resources provided in there, lots of bibliography listed. It is made in a way that's an easy read. So the scholars, those who are specifically interested in the topic of fairies cross-culturally, they found all the information really well organized on chapters. For example, tradition of fairy witches and fairy seers from one culture and the other, brought side by side with examples. How do they look like? Examples. The relegation of gods and goddesses to fairy kings and queens, side to side. We have examples from both bodies of lore. So it's that kind of thing. And a lot of stories, and the language is not exceedingly academic, so very reader friendly. The other book that I wrote, A Fairy Path, because it basically describes my path, which is a fairy-led path. The memoirs of a young fairy seer in training. Well, I'm the fairy seer in training that the book is about, and it describes the struggle of growing up in a materialistic culture and finding balance in between being true to yourself and pursue those things that really spoke to my heart. And I felt they really connect me with the land that I grew into, I grew from, with my grandmother, with my great-grandmother. So it was that side, and the adversity posed by having to keep everything underground and be careful to whom do you talk, because first of all, especially when you move in the 10, 11 years old, you begin to want to fit with the other kids. You want acceptance, you want peers, you don't really want to be the weirdo. But on the other hand, you don't want to give up those things that really are at the core of who you are, respectively, at the core of who I was. So it's that struggle a little bit. So it's also coming of age book. There's a lot of magic and magical occurrences from ranging from me casting a curse that's like plainly discussed, unintentional. I mean, I really acting in anger, and what are the outcomes of acting in anger, and how difficult it was to make amends after that because it ended up really badly. How I fall into fairies, how I lost the favors, and how our communication line was severed for a number of years. And then the epilogue gives the conclusion
Sounds
to what
fascinating.
happened and what turn things have taken. There is a lot to learn. And as a child, I had this magical journal, and I remember I wrote emphatically in black ink Daniela's Book of Magic or something like.
Oh, it sounds
I
fascinating.
swear. And whatever I could remember, the book no longer exists. I mean, we moved a number of times. I don't know what happened to it in the end, but I could remember enough material to reconstruct part of it, and it is in an appendix at the end of the book. So that autobiography comes also with a little fairy magic manual attached to it.
Oh, and
And
we
right
can
now I'm working on a third book, Fairy Herbs for Fairy Magic. My grandmother was very skilled with herbs. I got exposure to, and she was doing all her fairy herbalism. So I learned basically my foundations are from her. And now I'm writing a book and about it.
sounds fascinating. It sounds like you're extremely busy, and we all, as I
They keep me
said,
busy.
your books are coming out this year, with another one on the way, and wow, we're almost at the time of the end of our interview. So I just want to first thank you very much for all you've shared with us today. Hopefully this has given our audience insight to maybe not dismiss those little flickerings that we see in our peripheral vision. And I understand that on your blog and also the YouTube channel, which I'll be listing the links below this recording for anybody who wants to check out your work later. You've got some offerings, like simple little rituals, and how people can on a normal day-to-day basis actually connect back to this fairy realm to receive their blessings, or that open that communication again. Is that correct?
Yes. There is so the name of my blog is Whispers in the Twilight, and you'll have the links in the section there. And everything there is free material, and everything is, or 90% of it is very hands-on. So there are rituals that can be implemented, adapted. I was told by my fairy guides to actually follow the cycles of the Pleiades, with the understanding that when they're in certain positions, the veil, so to speak, between the worlds, the communication between the worlds is easier. So rituals done at that time tend to be more powerful. And there's like whole lists of rituals and the dates and all the details and what the powers are involved and how to do it. And by all means, feel free to adapt. There is a ritual, a spell, charm that I like to do at every ending of a calendar year on December 31st into January 1st. So it's called Out with the Old, In with the New. All the details there, just follow through. It is fun. It can be done as a family activity, so it's not something that's it's not appropriate for children or for non-believers. So it is fun. On my YouTube channel, which is Daniela Simina, so it's my name. I'm making available a few practical things. One of them being creating an abundance charm, and that involves use of fairy herbalism. Abundance, don't think necessarily of material abundance. It is abundance in terms of what do we invite in our lives on a broader scale, financial, health, connections, love, opportunity. So all that abundant. And it's a very detailed step-by-step tutorial and the meditation. Everything is included. YouTube, Daniela Simina. The link will be down in the resources. Enjoy, and I really hope that you'll find it useful.
Thank you very much, Daniela. It's been wonderful again, as I said, to be speaking with you.
Thank you so much.
So to the audience, if you'd like to find out more about Daniela's work, what she has to offer, when her books will be released, and also how to get back in touch with the fairies, our ancestral wisdom, please scroll down to the end of this recording and you'll find the links to her blog and also her website. So once again, it's been absolutely wonderful having you here, Daniela. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to the audience, Naratala, thank you very much.
You.
I hope you have enjoyed this interview as much as I have, and I look forward to seeing you again. Blessings.